to. Only one person is great. All right, so you guys, are you in some kind of interactive program here? Are you here from interest in a school group? Again, they were just like, hey, we want you to talk about stuff. And I was like, I can talk about things. But it's nice to know who I'm talking to. So do we have any programmers or art kids?
Both.
How many of you guys want to be game designers? All right. How many of you are interested in more AAA versus indie, say, or most of you, you don't really know. You'll take anything at this point, kind of thing. All right, fair enough. So I'm going to spend, in theory, the first half hour talking about things I did. I'm primarily an indie dev. I currently run a VR content studio full-time over in Culver City, and I also have a side indie game project that I work on in my other waking hours. So I'm juggling a little bit of both, and I have very little to no experience in AAA, so this will be extremely biased. The second half, I'll be talking a little bit about VR development, and hopefully a helpful way if any of you are interested in that. The best hint I can give is that the VR industry is your easiest ticket into a pretty awesome game job right after graduation, just because they're really looking for talented people, and no one really knows what they're doing, so you're going to be super at home in your first couple of years starting out right after graduation. AKA how I learned to find jobs and some money making things that I want to make. So my name is Robyn Tong. Currently, as I said, I'm the co-founder and creative head of Otherworld Interactive. We do VR content. We do usually about, at any given time, a third of our work will be some kind of independent thing that we want to make, and 2/3 will go towards contract work. So we've made things for Mattel, for Google. We've worked with various game companies. We've worked with Lionsgate, so kind of movies, games, whatever people want to throw at us. And as I said, I'm also the co-founder of a super tiny indie game, which I kickstarted a few years back with one partner. We were an IGF finalist and an Indicate Select, and it's a super, super indie game, which is why it's part-time, because it's about emotions and feelings and making people cry, which is not really AAA material. So I started out with a Bachelor of Computer Science and Fine Arts. I ended up interning at a startup at some point in my life. Went on to a master's when the job market after I graduated undergrad sucked. And then eventually, kind of simultaneously, kickstarted my game and founded this VR content studio. So I don't know how many of you are kind of like, I'm not super amazing at anything in particular. I'm pretty good at this thing or that thing. I think I have a cool skill set, but I'm not really sure how to advertise myself to a big company when I want to get a job. Yeah, that was me. I started university as a computer science major. And then I was like, this is really boring, and I swapped to kind of an interdisciplinary major. And around that time, I was fortunate enough to get kind of an internship at this local startup. So that was for 2 years on and off. It was an 8-person studio. We specifically made location-based entertainment, so these guys specialize in a very niche market where they were trying to make games that you could play while waiting in line. So our main target was like SeaWorld or Disneyland, people that had captive audiences that really wanted to entertain them, stop people bitching and moaning at them. So that was fun. Location-based entertainment is really great and really hard to find work in, unfortunately. So if you're super interested in theme parks, that kind of thing, super good luck to you. I have some friends who've managed it. Thinkwell is super great. Imagineering, obviously, if you can get it. And then a couple of small studios. They unfortunately went out of business about a year or two after I graduated undergrad, so it's a tough market to hack. I don't know if any of you are considering doing graduate programs in kind of interactive or video games, but I have experiences with 2 of the top programs. So I spent my senior year at the Entertainment Technology Center, which is a 2-year program. It's very vocational. They will shove you on a project. You will get a specific role, say audio designer, programmer. You'll be expected to do that role, and you'll kind of behave for a year and a half of the 2 years as kind of a small indie dev team. If you're lucky, you'll get to do your own project. More likely, you might do a cool client project, so they would have, EA would come to them with small weird things. They worked with, occasionally they work with foreign things like Ford, but they also have really cool projects. But essentially, I know I want to work in AAA. I want the indie studio experience. I want to actually hit the ground running with a product that I can say I worked on. And it's not really so much conceptual designing, touchy-feely indie type things. So I did a year there and kind of got the gist of it, did some really cool classes, and ultimately decided for my master's to head off to USC. USC is a 3-year program. It's very conceptual, so that is kind of touchy-feely. They won't hold your hand and teach you hard skills. They will, however, give you a really in-depth kind of background of film history, which, but also encourage you to explore other things that are out there. And it's cool if you want to do kind of a more artistic, less commercial approach, maybe less cool if you like, I want to make money after graduation and not sit in a giant pile of student debt. And that's a Master's of Fine Arts, as opposed to the other one, which is their weird specific vocational Master's. So I don't know if any of you are considering grad school, but I have kind of some thoughts on it. Is it worth it? The network I found was really great at USC and at the ETC. I still rely on a lot of these people if we're trying to find people to fill positions at our company. I'll poke them first. I'll poke friends of mine who I met through them. You get a structured environment. I'm fairly motivated, but not motivated enough to do things I did in grad school alone if someone hadn't been prodding me. You get to do personal projects. You're basically paying to do a personal project for yourself. So if you do graduate school, I encourage you to go, what's something I'll never get to make at a AAA company, because now I'm giving myself time to do it. And again, there's also vocational versus academic programs. So some of these will lead you more towards, hey, you want to work at Blizzard, etc. Some of these will go, you're an artiste, and we want to encourage this and see you blossom like a flower, and who knows if you'll make money. It's obviously expensive, and even though it's structured, never be mistaken that it's still exactly what you make of it. You have to go out and be willing to do things. Professors will not hold your hands, as you might have encountered here. So the other route that kind of traditionally one takes if one does not do any kind of specialized program, which a decade ago, 15 years ago, even now, worked really, really well, and I think works less well nowadays, is trying the quality assurance route. Maybe you're like, I want to work at Blizzard, let me start in QA and work my way up. I do know some people who've still managed to do that. I know others who've been in QA for 5 years plus, and despite the fact that they seem fairly aggressive about wanting to go elsewhere, have not had luck going elsewhere. If you're already qualified for internships, obviously, and you're having a hard time getting an actual associate's job or whatever right off the bat, check out internships. Basically, if you have a useful hard skill, especially if you're a programmer, then grad school might not really be necessary. If you want to be a designer ultimately and you can program, then that makes you pretty darn valuable. You just want to make sure you don't get stuck as the programmer forever. But I've seen a lot of friends do kind of horizontal movement out of that job position. Art's a little bit harder, I find, because at least in my experience with artists and as someone who was an artist for a bit, you just get kind of shoehorned into these less technical aspects of a project, and so it's kind of harder growth-wise to say, well, what about things like user interaction with this, or what if I want to change X, Y, or Z to make this part of the gameplay better? That's not as much of an option if you're just making art assets. And also, of course, if you go the non-degree route, you're now competing against people who've paid a buttload of money for an arguably useful, maybe, degree. And again, QA to being a designer, I think, is a little bit harder, but not impossible. And it's unstructured, so you better be motivated. So if you're skipping grad school, even if you're not, if you haven't figured it out, if you just want some cool reading, Jesse Schell's Art of Game Design is a classic, and it's kind of what the Carnegie Mellon's entertainment technology program is built off of. I think he has some really valuable insights. You can find a lot of his talks on YouTube. He's always really cool to speak with, and he's been around. He has some interesting thoughts, and his approach is somewhere between super commercial and super indie. Another one, which personally I have not read, but I've heard amazing things about, is Game Feel, which is a very different, more, I think, conceptual approach to design. It's less about A to B and more about, well, why does A make a player feel like B? And is that really how I want them to feel when they're doing this? It's really more about thoughtfulness in design. And finally, play a lot of things, make a lot of things, and that's really either route what you're going to end up doing. So when I graduated undergrad and decided to go to grad school because the job market sucked, my most important questions personally, again, this is probably a very personal thing, a very biased thing, was would I rather make experiences that are played by a shit ton of people, or was I super excited about making stuff that I really wanted to make? That's not to say that in AAA you won't end up getting to make things you really, really want to make, but if you want to be like, I can point to all this stuff and go, I had that meeting about this thing, and I decided that thing, and that steered the game in this huge different direction, that's going to be a lot harder, obviously, in AAA. For me, I don't really care if tons of people play my stuff, for better or worse. I was not super motivated in that regard, so for me it was all about, I want control over things. And the other question I asked myself was, did I want to work on a specialized role? Did I want to be the super awesome hardcore game programmer or the super amazing artist, or did I want to do a whole ton of things? And I get really, really bored doing one thing, so I said, I want to do a whole ton of things, which is a lot easier in indie dev, but honestly, it's hard to be an indie dev without the ability, I think. There was also the question of what kind of indie do you want to do when you grow up, if that's what you want to do. So you'll find the ultra indie. I think today this tends to be, there's a very artistic community within the indie community, which is things like Gone Home or The Novelist or Papers, Please. You have to be really lucky for these to catch on and do super well. I think there is enough of a niche market for you to do pretty well if you've got a good product. There's also the kind of indie, we liked playing video games as kids and made the games we wanted to play, like the World of Goo style indie. There's the indie plus contractor, which is a very practical person who wanted to make some money, was the route I'm mainly doing. So there'll be people like Shell Games, Alchemy, even Double Fine to an extent. They do their own projects, but they make sure that they keep the bills paid and the lights on by taking in other people's stuff. So a lot of these will make games for Disney. Alchemy, if you know them, they shifted from indie and contract indie to VR and recently got bought by Google, which is a really cool thing. If you want to make some money, you should get bought. There's the genre indie, which I kind of made up. It kind of falls under the label of the ultra indie, but there is the model of business where you go, I really like making this kind of game. I'm really good at it. I'm just going to spit out tons of this kind of game, and eventually one of them, for example, Angry Birds, will make a ton of money. So I'm going to make lots and lots of small mobile games. I'm going to work fast. I'm going to keep it small and be smart, and that's what I really want to do. And honestly, that's still pretty viable in terms of making a living. And then there's the not so indie, which, not to take a dump on these guys, they also make obviously really cool stuff. But you have to keep in mind as you're staying at the indie market that not all these guys are just sitting eating ramen in the dark. So games like Journey, they were backed by Sony. Sony loved what they did and said, here, have some money, you can be your indie team, but we have Sony money in marketing. Brothers is actually made by Starbreeze. They did Payday, shooting people in face games, not really indie. The Witness, Jonathan Blow made Braid using, I think, like $200,000 of his own money. And then when he made millions of dollars off of Braid, that went into The Witness. And even Stardew Valley, made by one dude, mostly in the dark, probably eating ramen, but ultimately he had a publisher, which technically makes him slightly less indie because he had someone helping him with marketing, which I think is infinitely valuable, and there's no harm in it. And if I had the option of having someone do marketing for me, I would take it. But just bearing in mind, when you see these awesome games, you see things like Journey, which is super gorgeous, it might not be realistic with the resources you have at hand. So maybe you need to start poking around in other deals or other ways to achieve that. So again, when you do these different indie production types, if you're looking at smaller companies to work for, you kind of got to keep these things in mind. Are you okay with not having money right away? Can you float on what you already have? Can you beat the government away from taking back your student loans for a while? Or do you want money like yesterday? There's the team size. I want to make the next, I don't know, Destiny. Well, you're probably not going to do that with, your 2 to 4 or 5 to 15 person team. At our studio, I think with overhead, you assume that every person that is on your team will cost you about $6,000 a month. So if you get $100,000 for your game, that's cool, but now you have to figure out how many people you can actually run for how many months before you go back to the ramen, I'm not making money right now. So I've worked with a lot of tiny teams, which my indie game department is, and then Otherworld is more of the small team, and then there's the rare middle-sized indie-ish studio, like say Double Fine, where I think there are probably 50 to 60 people, but it's very hard to keep them afloat anywhere between the small and tiny to the very, very large. And lastly, there's the market model to consider. So as much as I really like making games and I really hate business, you should consider, well, if I want to make money, I should probably make something that people want to buy. So right now, VR, super hot. You could grab a partner right now, make something, and probably make a few bucks because everyone wants VR experiences. And the bar of entry is pretty low. You can check it out on Google Play. You can probably get even Valve to grab something from you pretty quickly if it's shiny enough because they're looking for quality VR content. Mobile, again, I like the model of spit out a ton of mobile games as quickly as possible. It's pretty low overhead in terms of making them, and probably you'll make some money. There's the indie, which is the, I hope someone really likes something and it suddenly explodes because Reddit thought it was great. And then there's the very traditional game market, which is obviously, let me go to EA or Blizzard, etc., and hope to get my way. So of these indie approaches, I've done 2 of them. After I graduated USC, I started looking around and went, well, I guess I could get a job at a big place because I know how to do things now, maybe. But ultimately, none of the places I interviewed with I really liked. Even at a big AAA studio, you'll find that people don't necessarily know what they're doing. I graduated and was like, if I go to this big studio, get to learn from all these guys, they'll know exactly what they're doing, we'll have a schedule, no one will suffer, it'll be awesome. And that was not true at most places. I will not name names, but people I know who took jobs at a few of the places I applied, a year or 2 later that team got shut down. They didn't get stuff out. The higher-ups were not happy. When I interviewed there, they were like, it'll be like an indie environment. And I was like, that means we're going to work a ton. You're not going to pay me much. So watch out for that, too. That's not a good sell. So I have 2 companies currently. This is me and 1 partner. We both work full-time, so this is on the side. We're making our small, weird, sad game because we can. We can make whatever the hell we want because it's part-time. And we're not expecting it to necessarily make money. And that's really, really fun, but also hard. There's nothing like working 8 hours or more a day at one studio and then going, I need to do kind of the same thing when I get home tonight. And it's very, very slow. So this is my game Apartment, a separated place. The story with Apartment and why it was easier for me to decide I wanted to do it after graduation as an indie side project was it was my master's thesis. I finished it somewhat to a reasonable extent. I submitted it to some things and was like, maybe I'll finish it someday, but I need to get a job. And then we started getting awards, and I was like, oh, okay, maybe I'll finish it sooner, because people actually like this thing. That's pretty cool. So I went and did a little Kickstarter campaign. So if you have any Kickstarter questions, feel free to lob those at me later. And we were successful. We wanted $20K, which we estimated was just enough to do the things that we couldn't do ourselves. So my audio guy really, really wanted real instruments, and we were like, well, if we get $20K, we could grab some real instruments, musicians, do some recording to have great music. So that was part of the budget. And then we said, my art skills are really limited. It'd be really cool to have a character artist. That was part of our budget. And then we said, none of us does amazing 2D renderings, and I want an illustrator. And so that was part of our budget. So we literally aren't paying ourselves anything out of that. That's all going towards the things we cannot do ourselves. So if you make a super tiny indie company, the moral of the story is make sure you can do almost everything all by yourself and maybe scrounge up some money if there are things that you think are vital. But that, honestly, if we didn't have this, we still could have finished the game even without it. Just would have been spready. So the other indie model that I've subscribed to is Otherworld. This is something my business guy loved that I think is very overblown, but in theory we make the most transcendent things. We will make that claim. See if anyone argues with us. And like I said, we do a mixture of indie content and client contract stuff. So we subscribe to this model. We're an LLC. Both my companies are LLCs. If you have money that you don't want in your personal account, when I started the Kickstarter, I made a LLC for that particular project, so it wasn't all mixed up in my personal finances. Otherworld is an LLC, so if any of our clients decided to sue us, we won't personally get sued. Super handy. And we are small enough that currently all of our employees are technically full-time contracts. So if you're going to start an indie company, beware, because if you pull people onto full-time employment and they aren't you and they don't own part of the company, you will have to provide them with benefits. And if you suddenly don't have client work, you won't be able to pay them, and that's a big pain in the ass. So currently we have a lot of contractors we love who we hope to grab a full-time, but for now we have anywhere between 7 to 15 of them at any one time. We do VR because we got out of USC and went, people are paying anyone to make VR content. We could do that. That could be us. We could be anyone. And we also say, hey, we do AR too, because that's starting to slowly take off. I don't love VR AR. I think it's really, really super cool, but you take advantage of the things that are here, and this is a very rare opportunity for you to say, I want to make a thing. A lot of people will somehow see it because there's not a tons of things competing with the thing I'm making. So I can kind of do what I want as long as I'm playing in this new weird medium. And there's also money floating around. So you can go out there and grab that money. Anyone can go out there and grab the money. It's great. And again, we do contracts in indie. All right, so I'm going to wrap up the weird, vague indie ramble and just say that if I were you guys right now, and I wanted to make things in games, and I wanted to do anything in games really, no matter what role I was, I would say you should probably have these things under your belts. You should be really familiar with an engine. I like Unity 10. Unity's really easy. If you're an artist, Unity's pretty darn easy too. All of our art kids can go into Unity, place their stuff, set their materials, make a build for a cell phone or a computer, and that's great because since we're really small, I can't be there all the time looking over their shoulder, being an engineer and going, hey, can you fix all these things? So be familiar with Unity or Unreal or something, but if you have that as an artist, that makes you infinitely more valuable. Basic programming. Programming is hideous. It's gross. It yells at you all the time. It's full of bugs and things get set on fire. But it's really important that you can at least be like, hey, programmer, I want this thing to happen. I'm the designer. I have no idea if this is a feasible thing at all. Like, maybe at least be familiar enough to know when your requests make sense, when they don't make sense, when it's going to be a giant pain in the ass for your engineer to do, when it will break everything, that sort of thing. If you like a very specific genre, make sure that you play and know other things within that genre, so that when it comes time to say, maybe pitch your idea to someone who might give you money, you can be like, well, I know it's like this or that, but I think this other thing is really cool and new and no one's done it before. Make sure you know these things. Business really sucks. I hate business. I'm not the business person. But you should be able to read, say, contract and know what you're getting yourself into. Or if you have to hire someone briefly, be able to write that contract. And it's really, really easy, and there's examples online. Definitely good to at least be aware of. And also, please know stuff besides games. I know when I was an undergrad, well, I wasn't a super, super hyper game person in undergrad, but if you really want to go into games, there's nothing like having designers, especially if you're a designer, at the table who not only play games in their spare time, but are super into something really weird and random, and maybe read this weird article about something completely different that then comes into the game and creates something cool and unique, and something people haven't seen before. We need new, fresh ideas. We can't keep shooting people in the face all the time. So I think go out there, do stuff besides games, bring that back to your games. And now I'm going to switch gears and talk about VR. Have any of you worked in VR at all? All right, there we go. So I think VR is a little bit early days, it's a little bit premature, but like I said, people are willing to pay you money to make stuff, and that's really, really cool. And in LA alone, there are so many VR studios at any one time looking for people to occupy seats. So it's good to at least know a little bit about it. So I'm going to talk some technical things, some kind of higher level emotional things about VR. These are two of our most popular experiences, Café Âme and Sisters. Sisters is obviously a little super scary horror experience. Café Âme is a very ambient, playing around with identity and emotion experience. So in VR, we like to talk about this thing called presence. However, if you've ever been to a VR talk, people kind of whisper in awe and they go, oh my god, VR presence is amazing! And you're like, oh, I don't know what this is, what's the big deal? It sounds kind of like something hippie, I don't know. So apparently Wikipedia, it's so popular now that Wikipedia knows what it is. It's the visceral feeling of being in a simulated world. So it's a give me that you get for free in VR that we don't get when we're staring at a game on a 2D screen. So basically, you are in VR, you feel like you're in that world. It's really awesome. That's great. Of course, there are many ways you can break the idea of feeling present in a world. VR is still kind of young, there's glitches, there's latency, there's jitter, poor graphics, poor mechanics, the usual. And I like to think that being in a world is all well and cool, but there's only so many roller coaster experiences or VR beaches you can be on before you go, well, so what? I can go to the real beach. It'll take a while, I'll be stuck in traffic for 4 hours, but I'll be at the beach. So we're kind of at the early stages of VR, and everyone's still a little bit like, oh, cool, I'm on a beach. No, what's next? So I argue that we want to aim towards emotional presence, which is, we're in VR, it's a novelty, but how can we make them compelling and make them something that's not just the novelty, make sure it sticks around as a medium. So I'm going to define emotional presence as something that gives you an attachment to the world you're in, something that makes you believe in it and want to be there. And how can we evoke a moving presence is kind of a little bit of what I'll be talking today. Again, I'm not a VR evangelist. I think it's super cool. I really like telling stories, which is why I got into games, because I think telling interactive stories is really nifty. And I think we need to elevate VR beyond VR for VR's sake and figure out what comes next. So let's see, I think I have some videos to explain what exactly these are, but at Otherworld we tend to make projects in 6 weeks or less. Both of these examples are even shorter than that. Café Âme was a 3-week prototype, 3-person production team, and every time we make a prototype at Otherworld, we like to figure out like what's the cool thing that we're kind of looking at. In this case, it was embodiment and ambiance. This is a really old project at this point. It was made for the Oculus DK2, which was super cool at the time because you were like, yay, I can lean back and forth and smash my head into things in real time and in VR all at once. It's a little bit old, therefore, now. But we kind of did this thing that we thought was cool, and people really liked it on the internet, and they're very fickle on the internet, so I like to think that that counts for something. It really doesn't, but it's still cool. Here's kind of the 180 view. You're in this little French cafe at night. We had this really nice shader on the windows to be rain trickling down. You have this really awesome binaural audio going. It's just it's a nice space to be in, and there's a little bit more to it than meets the eye initially. Sisters is our most popular experience. It is currently at 3 or 3.5 million downloads. It is the thing we're best known for. We've gotten money to make additional content for it. People like it so much they gave us money to put ads in it. But it started as a 2-week prototype because I love horror movies, and I was like, it's almost Halloween, let's make a horror thing. So we made it in 2 weeks. We later took 2 weeks to polish it and actually bring actual artists on. But it was a 4-person production team. Probably gathered that at school. The primary design focus was indirect control, so it's horror. So the cool thing about horror, obviously, is you can have doors slamming, you can have creepy children giggling, and people who are going to whirl and be creeped out and want to do something about it, and therefore hunted down for you. And because it's horror, also designing a soundscape, while pretty vital to VR, is especially vital to horror. And this is one of our favorite videos. There's tons of YouTube videos of it online, which is even funnier.
The town's gone! Next to me, little Chucky chick.
Jeez.
I keep saying that quick.
No.
Don't still move from lightning.
Yes. So someone put their poor mother in our VR experience, and
Oh my
that was
God.
the reception for this. We've also since been on the show Practical Jokers, where they forced one of the guys to do it as like a penalty thing, which was also pretty funny. And surprising. It's surprising how freaked out adults are by obviously pretty low polygon environments. So this was built for Google Cardboard. You can get it for free on iOS, Android, etc. right now, and you will be amazed at the low resolution and the strange effectiveness of it. So let's see, what is this? I'm going to talk a little bit about ambiance. I think this is Café Âme. A little bit too bright here.
You can turn off the lights, or I'll help you. Right here.
There's always a light here.
Is that better?
Whoa.
So you can sit down. There's actually a bunch of dark videos, so you can just leave the lights on. It'll be fine. All right. So again, pretty simple experience. Not a ton of cool stuff to do, really. So we were really surprised by the reaction we got. You can see a little bit at the end, but clearly there's something funny going on in front of you, which I'll go into a little bit more. But conceptually, when I like to design a space, I think of a few things. So the setting for this, I said would be 1950s Parisian cafe. We got this cool Art Deco stuff going on. Cafe is empty, the streets are empty, the city is asleep except for you, which gives you this melancholy, lonely feeling. It also means we don't have to make people, which is great. The mood, again, kind of wistful, contemplative, melancholy. You got the rain, you got the rainfall, you got the sad radio music, you got the fact that nothing in this world is moving except you. And then narrative, shop is closed for the night. You are actually a robot, keeping watch over the shop, and there's a coffee cup on the table in front of you, but robots don't drink coffee. So there's just enough weird information in this environment that you're curious and want to know more about it, and hopefully we can tell you a little bit more about it and the minor interactive elements we put in there. So I'm sure you've all heard, keep it simple, stupid. Really super true for small teams. Scope inflation is obviously the worst possible thing that can happen to a project because it's kind of instant death unless you're willing to start chopping off limbs, and that's really painful when you have a cool idea. So there's the very popular 6-word stories. This one, for sale, baby shoes never worn. Super minimalistic, super open to interpretation, weirdly emotional, even if you're not into kids, don't have kids, want nothing to do with them. As soon as you start thinking about it, you can think obviously of a lot of tragic or maybe even non-tragic things that are happening. That's kind of what you want if you're creating these really tiny prototypes. So when we make a 2 to 4 week thing, we want a very tiny concept that has this really cool kernel of it that will shine through even if some of our other experiments have failed. Technical things that I've learned as I've done VR. Physically based shaders. Unity now has them built in. Basically shaders that are really, really good at mimicking real lighting are great in VR. As soon as you start faking lights in VR, the human brain and its capacity to pattern match starts worrying that something is not right and starts going, I'm not in real life, this is VR, screw this isn't real, I don't care, I'm out. So physically based shaders are really cool for that reason because it's just one step closer to mimicking reality. Even if you make something pretty stylized like this, it still feels great to be in. Polygons. Normally in games we go, polygons are the devil, unless you're on a high res console. If you're in mobile, even, obviously you don't want polygons in mobile. But in VR, even mobile VR, you do want to spend those polygons. You want to pump it full of polygons because, again, you're in VR, you have depth. Things like normal maps now suck because I can go all around and go, that's not actually a bump, that's normal map, it looks terrible. So you want to spend your polygons and spend them wisely to give a really good, a really tangible feel to your worlds. And then there's also just, for any game dev, really level of detail. So decide in advance what can I do with the artists I have on hand, what's the level of detail I want, because even if you can't muster the capacity to do crazy amounts of detail, you can make a really cool, really convincing world if you choose the right style. Not a great artist, but I'm pretty good at this point about choosing styles that work with what I got. Finally, you'll see back in this guy, another really cool thing to think about when you're doing VR is when you make a normal game, you have a 2D screen, people don't remember things on 2D screens as well because they lack the ability to move through them and your body lacks the ability to then go, oh yeah, there's a coffee cup this much to your right. In VR, you do get this spatial memory sense. And in VR, it is cool and awesome to do stupid things like have lights hanging down from the ceiling, because suddenly that provides an idea of how tall the ceiling is, and it gives me this great memory, and it gives me this cool thing poking down towards my face. So using all your axes and making sure that there's stuff coming out and creating depth on all 360 degrees is great. All right, so indirect control, also important in traditional games. If you've never heard this term, it's basically the idea that I want the player to do this thing, but if I tell them that, they might be a dick and they might not do it because players do that. It's also the, if I tell them to do that, it's less compelling than if they would feel like they did it of their own volition. So it's directing user attention. We do quite a number of things with all of our VR experiences to get this done. Use audio, visuals obviously, and narrative. So the example I'll be using again is Sisters, and we got this little foul-mouthed kid who made a video of himself and Sisters. some point he said, I can hear steps. So we have this sound cue that goes in this direction of the room to make you hopefully look over there. And he said, the door just opened. So we have the visual cue of the door animating to get you, again, to look in a certain direction. And then while you're busy looking in that direction, and I know that you're looking in this direction because I'm checking with my programming, I can then make sure that the really super creepy dolls are disappearing and doing their own thing. So at one point he says, one of the dolls is gone, and then the other doll is gone, and then he sees it on the floor all of a sudden with a sound cue that we pretend means it fell off the mantle, but we didn't want to animate that, so it never does that. But you're looking over here, so you don't care. And the narrative reason is I want to keep track of these dolls because they're super freaking creepy. Everyone worries about these dolls. They see them in the beginning when everything is kind of fine and dandy, and then throughout the experience, as the lights turn on and off and creepy things happening, they're like, there's these dolls, they're going to kill me, I don't like those dolls, I need to keep an eye on them. There's some cool bonus things to indirect control, and cool bonuses, I think, to VR and genre. So if you know your genre, obviously horror, we can do all these awesome things. That's kind of a cheat because people instinctively are fearing for their lives and wanting to keep track of possible threats. Know the mood you want to set, so we have obviously sad robot cafe versus super creepy haunted house. Change things accordingly. And know your narrative. The nice thing about VR that's a little bit less true maybe of indie games right now is VR is so alien to people that tropes are super, super awesome. So like scary dolls, there are a lot of scary dolls in the world, but scary dolls in VR means even if I'm grandma and I've never put VR on in my life, I'm suddenly in something I'm familiar with, some kind of horror movie, and I know what I want to keep track of without having to be told, without even knowing the controls, without even really knowing what's going on. So tropes can be super, super handy if used properly. All right, so I mentioned, for better or for worse, in game development, audio is kind of the ugly stepchild. We go, oh yeah, I should have music in my game somewhere towards the last month of development, but I realize there's not, and I have had so many other things to do, and everything's on fire, and then I'm like, I guess I should give them something to listen to while they're playing my cool game. That should never be the case with game dev. It will continue to be the case simply because there's so many other things to do that you won't even be able to have a game if you don't complete these things. So audio, sadly, is the thing that you can put off and not include, but you should. In VR, though, if you have crappy audio in VR, it completely breaks whatever reality you're trying to convey. If you're in even a quiet room, in reality you have a room sound, so that kind of gives your ears a sense of, oh, there's air circulating, that's telling me a little bit about the space that I'm in. Is there carpet, is there hardwood, et cetera, et cetera. Really, really vital in general in VR, and really, really vital in horror. So when it comes to designing a soundscape, I'm kind of going to break down what we've done in this sequence with the foul mouth kit again, and hopefully you'll be able to hear it. Oops.
Why is it?
That's why we avoid making characters, but it works pretty well in VR, I swear. So we have a ton of layers. With VR, unlike a traditional game necessarily, you really want to use spatial audio. So if the doll's falling down over there, I'm going to put my sound object over there so that the player knows where it's coming from and will probably look accordingly. With that particular scene, there's just a shit ton of layers. So we have audio cues. In this case, we have the creepy lady breathing in the corner. So you're like, there's a weird sound. It's coming from that direction. I should look over there. Yeah, unfortunately you're glued to the couch, so that's not an option. We also layer music and sound effects. So we have this really unsettling bass undertone that, in theory, you might not even really notice, but adds a lot to your senses. And we have the sound effects, thunder, lightning, etc., all spatialized. finally, we also have, in Sisters in particular, because it's horror, we have a series of subliminal sounds, which sound really dumb by themselves. In this case, it's a heartbeat. So the entire experience, this heartbeat is super low-key on underneath everything else. As action starts to rise in the experience, the heartbeat starts to get more intense. And you don't really notice it when you're in it because you're too busy making sure you don't die, but it really adds just this extra level of stress, which is awesome, but not for people playing it. And then finally, we use a lot of stingers, which are the equivalent of the horror movie jump scare type things or any kind of aha moments. Oops. So that's, and then lastly, with VR, you could do this with traditional games. And we do this to a degree just in engine. I think as engines get better, you won't really need binaural audio, but binaural audio, if you've seen on YouTube, there's a really cool example called the barbershop. It's recorded such that two mics are basically placed on a mannequin that mimics a human head, and then you do all your cool sound recordings around these two mics, so that before when you use the audio in your game, or when you play it back on your computer, it really sounds like you were that foam head with the mics in your ears, and you hear it exactly in that way. If you check out the barbershop example, you'll hear it feels like the guy's whispering on your neck, and it's really, really disturbing. Let's see. I think our binaural audio for this one was, yes, our super creepy ghost kid. The thing to remember with binaural audio is unlike spatial audio, where if I put it over here, it will stay over here no matter where my person's looking. Binaural audio is actually stuck to your head, so it works really great for ghosts, but if you have it attached to something actually in the scene, it's not really going to work, because no matter what, the right ear is always going to hear the same thing, even if they're turned all the way away from that object. The last thing we're going to talk about is kind of this weird abstract thing that VR is not great at right now because its hardware is pretty limited, but it's still kind of fun to play with. So that's the idea of embodiment, or who am I? So with Sisters and with a lot of VR experiences right now, if you look down, you don't have a body, and no one really cares. We're kind of used to that in other games. It kind of is awkward even if there is a body. It's hard to do well because you have control over the player's head, but not really anything else, so this is going to move out of sync with whatever they're doing, and that sucks. So it's perfectly okay to just say, you're no one in particular. People accept that. That's fine. And honestly, I think most of the time that's the best way to go, because at least they won't be distracted by whatever you're trying to do to them. Café Âme we made an exception for. We wanted to try, instead of making the player become this character that they control, we wanted to almost have this character that in some way might exert some control over the player. So we placed you in the DK2 at the time, which allowed you to do kind of the sixed off, leaning around, giving you a sense of depth. We said, hey, you're seated at this thing, you look down, you got this cool robot body, and we knew we wanted to have it kind of move and maybe have you end up mimicking its motions, so we kind of got creative. We made this rig. Sort of playing. I don't know what's going on with it. But essentially, instead of the usual rig on an animated character, what's driven by a root somewhere in the torso, we have it driven by the head. So this means if you're the player and you're sitting there and you're like, oh, what happens if I sit up? Then the whole rig kind of moves up with you. If you lean, he kind of starts leaning. His hands are at all times attached to this table to kind of try to encourage you not to run around in our cabled VR headset. Nice job. But wrong one. Don't auto-save that. But essentially, the end result is, in some ways, you kind of get to be the robot, and in some ways, he forces you to be him. So the great thing here, which we play around with, which I think I might have a video of, yes, but seriously, who am I? Is this really cool moment, which I think is the reason why this experience was at all interesting to people, because it was very simple in the end. Which is, everyone goes and turns and looks to the right, and you can see only a little bit here, but we actually managed to do a full body reflection. So we had 4 cameras going in the scene, which at the time was really taxing for the hardware. But because the head is attached, he moves back and forth. If you stand, etc., he starts to mimic your movements. And this is less cool maybe now than it was. 2 years ago we made it, but we actually beat Oculus to this, which was really nifty. And I think it's the reason why people like this so much is they go in, they're like, cool, I'm in a coffee shop, I get that. And then they're like, holy crap, that's not me. We had some people freak out, some people giggled. I think at least one lady screamed. And so it was just this really, really weird moment for people that really hit them with something. Who knows what? I think it varies person to person. And that, to me, is kind of the coolest thing you can do, making these experiences. So that's kind of my thoughts on this thing called emotional presence. And honestly, a lot of these fall into just general VR development and general game development, ambiance and direct control, design, soundscape, and embodiment. I guess we have like 9 minutes if you want to ask any questions. And here's my contact info. Feel free to email me.
Because when I was at an AIGA event, which is for like, graphic designers, it's their international organization, they were doing like a workshop for VR, and this group called Secret Location came in. They're based in
They did the Sleepy Hollow.
Yeah, and so it was really interesting because one of the questions that were brought up was when you're doing VR, you give, like, for example, horror I think is probably like the best example, where you're giving them these kinds of like real world experiences. So sometimes like it's really interesting because you're talking about like giving people PTSD during these like when they experience these types of things. So I was wondering what your thoughts were.
Yeah, so I very much love like supernatural horror, like The Ring, etc., which I think is fairly hard, hopefully, to scar people with. I actively avoid blood and gore because I think A, it's kind of boring, overused, and a crutch, and B, I don't want to scar people for life. We kind of try to walk the line of the Disney Haunted Mansion, where like she's creepy, but she's probably not going to inflict lasting harm unless you already really hate dolls, in which case don't dance. But no, I think as game designers in general, there's a certain responsibility to make content that hopefully gives people something good, whether that's entertainment or a new thought or something. In VR, I think that's especially more so true. A lot of people, for example, are experimenting using VR to treat PTSD. A lot of people will go on about kind of the empathy factor of VR, and therefore if you make these really dark, creepy, or gory, or terrifying experiences, yes, you could do terrible things to people. I don't know if that answers the question, but essentially I like to walk the line of, it's kind of kitschy and a little bit cheesy, and I'm okay with that. It still startles people, but I like them giggling and screaming as opposed to screaming and crying and hiding in a corner. Back.
So for these two games, do you have to like construct a story around what you wanted to happen? Because you can't always control what the user's going to do, right? Like you're trying to have the direct control, like you said. But so it's something that's going to happen like every time, and so are you just trying to push them towards a one single like storyline the whole time?
So a lot of games do this, and a lot of them do it really discreetly unless you're looking for it. If you ever played Dead Space, my favorite thing about the original Dead Space is you're on this ship and you're running around and you're like, what happened here? I don't know. And every time you turn a corner, there's like shadows, people screaming, things dying, and you're like, I just missed someone else and they just died somehow. And ultimately you're like, it was me. I did this. I'm triggering everything. What's going on? So most games will use these triggers, whether they use them really well, where you feel like it's just naturally happening, or whether they use them too often, where you're like, again, you died again, you couldn't have held up for 5 more minutes. So with Sisters, with Café Âme, with a lot of our more linear narrative experiences, there is a through line of events. So I will write a script similar in some ways to a movie script, where I'm like, I want this event to happen, and then maybe I'll do this puzzle, then this event happens, then we have this big scare, then blah, blah, blah. Meanwhile, the game is listening to you. So Sisters is awesome to explain because you're sitting in a room on a couch the whole time. So throughout the experience, I keep track of where you are in kind of the timeline of events. Not actually at 5 minutes this will happen, but you did this and now we're waiting for this other thing to happen. We have the system tracking where you're looking. So I know where you're looking at any one time, so it'll be very hard for you to catch me popping objects on and off. We have the sound cues, which hopefully will make you involuntarily look where I want you to look. We then usually back it up with some kind of visual cue, which hopefully if you're like, what's going on? You'll be like, oh, that thing's moving. So for the average user, it works really, really well. If you have some of these jerks who are just like, I'm doing this the whole time, or like, I forgot I can turn around, then there's not much unfortunately to do for them there. But usually, the average playtime say is like 3 minutes, and then sometimes we'll have people who take like 5 or 6 minutes, and I get nervous, but they will figure it out, and they don't seem too bothered by the fact that they kind of sat there for a while. So.
Okay, so it is one storyline. It's not like a bunch of triggers can go in different like branches.
You can start doing that, but obviously, I loved branching narrative when I was younger. I still kind of do, but it's really hard to do it in a way where it feels like I didn't get the shittier story, or it's like the Walking Dead thing where you're like, I made this great choice. My choice didn't matter, shit. Or you, as the developer, then spent another year making all this cool content, and half your player base didn't see it, and that sucks too.
Where do you see the future of VR development going, and do you see it as a lucrative career?
Two different questions. I think that VR jumped the gun a little bit. Oculus obviously set it off with the Kickstarter because it made all the big guys, Google, Microsoft, etc., go, oh crap, we better get on this because they started the cascade. Hardware is a little bit too expensive, a little bit too big right now. I think it's overblown. You'll see investors are starting to maybe slowly realize that it's hard to make your money back right now. But there's still enough force that we're doing fine, for example. Basically, I think VR isn't going to go away. I don't think it's going to consume PC gaming anytime soon, but I think probably in the next 5 to 10 years, it'll start being cheap enough and mainstream enough. More people will be doing the check out your virtual wardrobe, or let me see this condo I want to build before I build it kind of things, those sort of uses, as opposed to just gaming, no home gaming. And in terms of lucrativeness, still a lot of people giving investment money, still a lot of big companies wanting to use it for marketing or other experiences, and because people like Google, Microsoft, Oculus / Facebook, they don't want it to fail, they put a ton of money in, so they are willing to give other people money to make content for them. So there's quite a lot of free money to be had for VR, and if you're smart and kind of keep a smaller studio, I think you can very much make not necessarily a super ridiculously wealthy career, but if you want to make your own stuff, it's the best opportunity to make your own stuff. Make sure people see it, and not just eat ramen.
Cool. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Do you think that we'd ever get to like those fantasy movie kind of VR stuff?
Like Ready Player One? Probably. I think there's a lot of work in haptic feedback. So I'm sitting in my room, but I need some kind of physical indicator that I'm touching sand on the beach. Once we get those kind of technologies, people are working on smell-o-vision in VR, which people have been trying to do for a decade or so now, so maybe this is those guys' chance to make something out of that. It's going to take a really long time. I don't even know if we'll ever do like the physical full-body suits because that just seems silly. Maybe we're going to do something like Existence, and just have ports in our body that will make our brain think we're doing certain things correctly. I think it's very possible, but maybe, who knows? Who knows if it'll do that before we do it. It'll do.
You're talking about looking at normals differently in VR. Is there any difference in putting art assets into VR as to regular games?
So let's see. So it depends what you're making it for. If you're doing mobile, mobile is kind of nice because people can only do this, they can't do this thing, so therefore you can control the angles they're seeing all of your work at. The normals, the polygons, lighting is obviously more important than usual. The main thing to remember is especially if you start working on the Vive or the Rift or the high-end head-mounted displays, it gets trickier because now your players can put their faces through your art. So for example, we make a lot of puzzle games. We'll be like, there's a desk, you have to unlock the drawer and get this thing. What do you do if the person sticks their face through your desk and they can see everything in there? So in terms of actual solid art assets like models, less so, but in terms of thinking about how you're designing these things, there's always that to consider. Do you hide the objects, which is on your engineer? Do you have some kind of shader maybe that fills it with fog so you can't see in there? All right, anyone else? Awesome. Feel free to email with questions with anything. I think I'm the only lady speaker here today, so if you're a woman or a minority who wants to go into games and you've heard all these horror stories, I haven't really encountered anything. I think my recommendation is just you belong there just as much as anyone else. Don't let them tell you what